Viking raids are often depicted as swift and merciless assaults. Long ships rapidly approaching the shores, fierce warriors with axes poised, villages engulfed in flames. But what happened after the clamor of battle subsided? When the smoke cleared and the losses were tallied, unresolved issues remained. The surviving widows faced a reality rarely mentioned in historical chronicles, not only grief and destitution, but also cold, calculated exploitation. The events described are based on historical research and facts drawn from archaeological finds, see chronicles such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Let us delve into these pages of history. The morning after a raid, Viking detachments were in no hurry to leave the conquered lands. They had unfinished business, captured property to appropriate, and widows who represented a particular interest under Old Norse law, unclaimed assets that could be lawfully confiscated by right of conquest. This was not merely random violence, but a meticulously planned appropriation governed by rules written in blood and silver. Lindisfarne, 93 AD. The monastery was reduced to ashes, but the village survived. 37 women lost their husbands in the battles. At dawn, Scandinavian warlords, accompanied by scribes, went from house to house, inventorying everything: grain stores, livestock, tools, and, of course, the women themselves. Each widow was assessed not by the depth of her sorrow, but by her potential value, her skill at weaving, her knowledge of herbs, her ability to bear children. The Danelaw territories serve as a clear example of how this worked in practice. York, 866 AD. After Ivar, the Boneless, captured the city, his warriors did not merely occupy it, but also redistributed resources. Property documents from that period, written in Latin but incorporating Old Norse runes, testify to how one widow after another transferred land, homes, and even children to Viking settlers. And this occurred not at sword point, but within a legal framework. According to Old Norse law, a woman deprived of a male protector could be claimed by any man capable of providing for her. It was a forced marriage, veiled as legal protection. However, the sagas omit one crucial detail. Many widows had a choice: either marry and retain a certain status, or be sold into slavery. Records from the Dublin slave market in 878 AD detail the value of grieving mothers: 15 silver coins for a woman under 30 skilled in textiles, 10 coins for older women with craft skills, and 5 coins for those too broken to be useful. Children were sold separately. Archaeological findings in mass graves near plundered settlements reveal a different tragic picture. Some widows rejected both options. Collective suicides, committed the day after raids, were common enough to leave their mark on the earth. In a pit near Repton, the remains of 9 women and 16 children were discovered, all with knife wounds to the neck, inflicted at the same angle and depth, indicating self-infliction. Thus, the most brutal aspect was not the conquest itself, but the timing. Vikings understood that the fresh pain of loss made women more vulnerable. Strike quickly, let the shock settle overnight, and then offer a choice: protection through marriage or slavery. The day after the massacre was when resistance was minimal and despair was maximal. Psychological warfare, cloaked in legal procedure. For those who agreed to marriage, the terms were harsh. The new husband gained complete control over everything the widow owned: land, livestock, and children from her first marriage. She was allowed to keep only personal items that could fit into a single chest. Her former name died with her husband. Her new identity belonged entirely to her captor. Marriage contracts from 9th century Jorvik show the same formula repeated dozens of times: complete legal capitulation in exchange for basic survival. The legal system was brutal but effective. Old Norse law codes, preserved in later Icelandic manuscripts but reflecting much older traditions, detailed the mechanism of widow appropriation. A woman became legally available for seizure 24 hours after the confirmed death of her husband. Any Viking warrior could assert his rights by appearing before the local jarl with witnesses and a bride price. The widow had no say. Her consent was implied by her husband's defeat. Evidence from Hedeby shows how systematic this process became. Late 9th century slave market records listed hundreds of military widows alongside ordinary captives. But these were not merely random women captured during raids. These were wives of defeated warriors who had undergone legal procedures before being sold. Each entry contained information about the woman's former status, her husband's name and rank, and her assessed skills. Inventory, not people. The psychological manipulation was as carefully calculated as the legal system. Viking warlords understood that immediate remarriage served multiple purposes. It severed the widow's ties to her past life while binding her to Scandinavian settlements. Speed was critical. Giving a woman time to grieve could allow her to organize resistance. Giving her time to connect with other widows could lead to coordinated escape attempts. Strike while shock and isolation reign. Shock and alienation prevailed. However, there were those who resisted. Asser's chronicle tells of a group of widows who resorted to poisoning their future husbands, adding hemlock to the wedding ale. All 14 died within hours. The women faced severe punishment, being burned alive the next day, but their desperate act halted this practice in that region for a full 2 years. Resistance, though fraught with immense risks, sometimes yielded results. Often resistance manifested in more subtle forms. Archaeological findings from Scandinavian settlements across England reveal patterns of strange deaths among newlywed husbands, a higher mortality rate among Viking men married to local widows compared to those who brought wives from Scandinavia. Tools breaking at critical moments, contaminated food supplies, weapons disappearing during attacks. Widows found ways to kill slowly and subtly. This system proved viable because it served several purposes simultaneously. Viking invaders gained immediate settlement of conquered territories. Widows acquired a chance at survival, and the legal basis ensured that the legitimacy of the marriages could not be challenged by other kingdoms. On paper, everything looked impeccable. Violence was skillfully laundered through law. What made it particularly sinister was its organized nature. Ships and crews carried marriage contracts in their chests alongside weapons, standard forms, with fields to fill in names and property information. This was not spontaneous cruelty, but meticulously planned exploitation, thoroughly documented. Business conducted directly over fresh graves. The economic expediency was ruthless. A land-owning widow was more valuable alive and married than dead or enslaved. Her knowledge of local soil conditions, weather patterns, and trade connections contributed to the efficiency of Scandinavian settlements. However, this knowledge came at a high price, complete submission to the legal fiction that she was being protected, not exploited. Dublin archives reveal the true scale of the widow trade. Between 870 and 900 AD, over 3,000 women appeared in slave market documents under the designation recently widowed. This term was a code for military widows who had rejected marriage proposals. Once on the slave markets, their value was determined by brutal logic. The youngest and most fertile were prized most. Older women with craft skills brought moderate income, and those too traumatized to work were sold in bulk for manual labor. The presence of children complicated matters. Old Norse law viewed a widow's children from a previous marriage as property that transferred with her. But older children, especially boys over 12, were perceived as a potential threat, a living reminder of a defeated enemy and possible future avengers. Many marriage contracts of the time contained clauses for the immediate sale or expulsion of boys reaching a certain age. Archaeological data from settlement sites corroborate this practice. Mass graves of children found near Scandinavian colonies contain a disproportionate number of boys aged 12 12 to 16. These were not battle casualties. These burials date months or even years after the initial conquest. Bone analysis indicates malnutrition and signs of heavy labor. The unwanted sons of defeated enemies were tormented to death or simply abandoned. Some widows found ways to save their children. Later, genealogical records reveal patterns of local children being adopted by Scandinavian settlers with suspicious frequency. DNA analysis of medieval remains found in areas with high concentrations of Scandinavian populations shows that many adopted children were actually the biological offspring of local women and their deceased husbands, hidden in plain sight through false identity claims. Geographical patterns are also telling. The appropriation of widows was most systematic in areas where Scandinavian settlement was planned in advance, rather than occurring spontaneously. Organized colonies situated along river systems, such as the Thames and Seine, show higher rates of forced marriages than scattered settlements that arose along raid routes. This was social engineering, not merely an expression of individual opportunism. Temporal patterns are no less indicative. Most marriages with widows were concluded during specific seasons, late autumn, after the harvest, when food supplies were plentiful and winter isolation hindered escape attempts. Scandinavians understood that a woman's reliance on the survival of the household during the hardest months created a psychological dependency that surpassed physical limitations. Religious conversion became another tool of control. Many marriage contracts obliged the widow to renounce Christian rites and adopt Scandinavian religious traditions. However, archaeological findings in cemeteries suggest that this conversion was often superficial. Mixed pagan and Christian symbols are frequently found in grave goods and Scandinavian settlements, implying that women secretly maintained their original beliefs while formally observing the required pagan rituals. The Viking Age, contrary to popular belief, was marked not only by warlike raids and conquests, but also by the systematic exploitation of the female population in conquered territories. The study of historical documents and archaeological finds reveals a grim picture of how Scandinavian settlers used legal loopholes and cultural customs to appropriate the property and personal freedom of widows. Legal fiction served as a convenient tool to mask plunder. Despite the existence of marriage contracts intended to protect widows' assets, in practice, there was systematic embezzlement of their property. Land registries from the Danelaw indicate that the property of military widows was regularly undervalued during marriage negotiations, with the difference appropriated by Scandinavian officials overseeing the transfer process. Particularly sophisticated operations involved advanced planning. Viking vanguard units engaged in reconnaissance, identifying wealthy widows even before raids began. Information about women controlling significant assets was factored into the selection of targets for attacks. The raids themselves were sometimes organized to kill specific husbands, leaving their wives alive, whose property made them attractive marital prospects. Archaeological finds in the form of hoards reveal another aspect of this system. Many buried Viking Age treasures contain predominantly women's jewelry and silverware, items not typically hidden during casual raids. The dating and location of these finds suggest they were caches hastily buried by women who suspected they were being targeted for the appropriation of their property after their husbands' deaths. Contrary to widespread belief, resistance to this system was prevalent. Recent analysis of runic inscriptions found in various parts of England has revealed coded messages between settlements, warning of approaching marriage raids and coordinating escape routes. Women created their own intelligence network, exchanging information about safe areas and which Viking chiefs could be trusted or should be avoided. Trade routes played an important role in the widow economy. The same networks used for trading slaves and luxury goods also served to move enslaved women between Scandinavian settlements. Women were sold as ordinary commodities, transported from less desirable locations to areas where their skills or property were valued higher. Over time, legal documentation became increasingly complex. Later marriage contracts contained detailed inventories of a widow's property, standardized schedules for compensation for various types of property losses, and even clauses governing the treatment of children from previous marriages. What began as crude exploitation gradually transformed into legalized human trafficking. In some regions, different approaches were adopted. In areas where Scandinavian settlements were sparse, temporary marriages became a common practice. Formal unions concluded only for the duration of the raids. After this period, the woman was either freed or sold, depending on her behavior during the marital period. In such contracts, women were treated as seasonal assets, similar to livestock or agricultural implements. The demographic consequences of these actions were significant. Studies of the population of England in the 9th and 10th centuries revealed a substantial gender imbalance in areas of active Scandinavian colonization, significantly more adult women than men, and fewer children than expected. The combination of forced marriages, child separation, and systematic exploitation led to the breakdown of normal family relations. Recent excavations at a farm near Whitby led to the discovery of an artifact that changes our understanding of this system. Beneath the floor of a typical Scandinavian house, archaeologists found a cache of women's jewelry and coins, hidden wealth that was never included in any marriage contract. The dating of the find coincides with the raid period of 85 AD. This suggests that some widows planned long-term resistance, hiding resources for a possible escape. Among the treasures was a tablet with a runic inscription that can be translated as "When winter ends." Even under oppression, women did not lose hope for freedom. The tablet also depicted a detailed map indicating safe routes into unconquered territories and the names of allies prepared to offer refuge. The Scandinavian legal system, designed to appropriate widows, gave rise to its own underground railroad, operated by the very women it was intended to control. This resistance network spanned 3 kingdoms, moving women and children to safety through a system as organized as the one that oppressed them. The scale of this activity becomes apparent when mapping the entire network, which stretched from the Orkney Islands to Kiev. Scandinavian settlements exhibit similar patterns regarding the integration of widows. The same legal formulas, the same temporal protocols, the same signs of resistance found in archaeological records. This was not a manifestation of local opportunism, but part of an imperial policy executed with military precision. Training in this practice was also systematic. Young Viking warriors learned widow appropriation procedures alongside weapon skills and navigation. Runic stones found in Denmark contain inscriptions that can be translated as instructional maxims: strike the man, claim the woman, hold the land. This concise formula expresses the essence of a doctrine, not random improvisation. It was a calculated doctrine, not episodic acts of violence. The seasonal rhythms of life became a sinister backdrop for tragedies. Viking raids often coincided with harvest festivals or religious ceremonies, when the male population was concentrated in one place and most vulnerable. The calculation was cynical: to create as many widows as possible before winter, when women particularly needed male protection for survival. The Scandinavians turned weather conditions into a tool of oppression. Trade routes served as the arteries of the system. Merchant ships carried not only goods, but also marriage agents, specialists in assessing widows and arranging their transfer between settlements. Bergen price lists demonstrate the existence of standardized tariffs for various categories of women, adjusted according to fluctuations in supply and demand in the Scandinavian world. The religious aspect added another layer of control. Marriage contracts often obliged widows to participate in pagan rituals, which conflicted with their Christian beliefs: consuming horse meat, participating in blood sacrifices, wearing amulets dedicated to pagan gods, such as Thor. Spiritual violence aimed to suppress psychological resistance, just as legal restrictions undermined economic independence. Children became a tool of leverage, exposing the true brutality of the system. Marriage contracts often contained clauses allowing the new husband to sell or expel the widow's children within the first year of marriage. This created a constant threat, complete submission or loss of children. The leverage was absolute and renewable. Icelandic chronicles, such as the Landnáma Book of Settlements, testify to how this practice evolved into an enduring social institution. They list dozens of settlement founders whose wives were captured through conquest, but whose children fully integrated into Scandinavian society within 2 generations. Descendants born from forced marriages were indistinguishable from those of voluntary unions. Cultural genocide, disguised as family creation. Archaeological findings confirm written accounts with unflinching clarity. Analysis of skeletons discovered in Norse cemeteries reveals patterns of healed fractures consistent with domestic violence, broken ribs, orbital fractures, and wrist injuries sustained while resisting. These bone markers are found almost exclusively in the graves of women buried with artifacts combining Norse and Celtic elements, offering archaeological confirmation of forced cultural assimilation. Economic data points to a systematic appropriation of wealth. Land records from the Danelaw indicate that the value of land owned by widowed women typically decreased by 60% within 5 years of a forced remarriage. The wealth didn't vanish. It flowed into the hands of Norse merchants and officials who managed the marriage system. This was legally sanctioned plunder on an industrial scale. However, some widows found ways to resist. Archaeological discoveries of hidden caches indicate that many women learned to hide valuables, hoping their children would find them years later. These were seeds of future independence, sown in unfreedom. Such resistance caches have been found across England, suggesting coordinated actions by women who never met each other. The geographical distribution attests to strategic planning at the highest level. The Norse appropriation of widows was most intense in settlements located in fertile river valleys, with complete winter isolation. This pattern points to centralized planning that prioritized economic gain and control over mere opportunism. Medical knowledge became a weapon in the hands of both sides. Old Norse laws obligated new husbands to provide basic medical care for their wives. However, data from settlement excavations show that many widows used their knowledge of traditional medicine to prepare subtle poisons that caused chronic illnesses rather than quick death. Resistance was enacted through medicine, turning care into warfare. Marriage markets spawned their own cruel innovations. By the 10th century, some Norse settlements began hosting seasonal bride fairs where multiple widows were put up for bidding. These events combined the legal framework of marriage with the economic efficiency of slave auctions, creating hybrid institutions that maximized both legitimacy and profit. The legal appeal process reveals the system's sophistication. Some marriage contracts allowed widows to petition Norse assemblies for release from cruel husbands. However, this process required male support and substantial financial guarantees, making the legal path to freedom accessible only to women with hidden resources. Evidence from past eras emerges through the centuries, revealing unexpected facets of resistance to oppression. Even under the strict legal system imposed by conquerors, the subjugated found ways to assert their will and strike back. The influence of children raised in conditions of cultural blending manifests in the most unexpected artifacts. Runic inscriptions found in Norse settlements contain drawings and messages, presumably created by children. Linguistic analysis of these texts reveals a curious mix of linguistic patterns, indicating that the young authors, at the intersection of cultures, used the Norse language in the public sphere but retained Celtic or Anglo-Saxon roots in private communication. Organized resistance spanned vast territories. Coded symbols recurring in textiles created by women from Scotland to Ukraine attest to a widespread communication system permeating the Norse world. These hidden languages, developed by women deprived of other means of expression, manifested in fabric patterns, metal ornaments, and even kitchenware. Unexpected evidence of resistance is found in the analysis of medieval pollen deposits. In areas of intense Norse agriculture, sharp shifts in crop patterns occurred within decades of the conquest. Local crops were replaced by Norse varieties, but this transition was accompanied by signs of deliberate sabotage. Crop failures, which could only have been caused by intentional mischief from people intimately familiar with local conditions, point to a hidden struggle. The pollen data reveals a profound aspect of resistance. Widows forcibly married to conquerors not only protected themselves and their children, but also waged a true agricultural war. Using their knowledge of local farming, they created artificial food shortages, weakening Norse settlements from within. Famine became a weapon in the hands of those considered powerless. The irony of history is that the legal system legitimizing the exploitation of widows simultaneously created the evidence that exposed it. Every marriage contract, every property transfer, every record of slave sales, all these documents survived because they appeared official and legitimate. The Vikings meticulously documented their brutality, allowing modern researchers to reconstruct a 9-century-old picture of events, contract by contract, name by name. But they also documented the resistance. Every hidden hoard, every coded message, every act of sabotage left its mark in the archaeological record. Women whom they tried to erase from history wrote their own, burying silver and poisoned grain, leaving behind evidence of their own acts of war for future generations.